The only sound was our breathing, torn and ragged, a desperate rhythm in the sterile silence of the hotel room. Below us, 30 floors down, the lights of Manhattan glittered like a cold, indifferent sea of diamonds. Here, in this anonymous space, bought for a few $100s, the world was nothing but the scent of his skin and the slick heat between my thighs. His hands were tangled in my hair, anchoring me, pulling my head back as my hips rose to meet his, a frantic, unspoken demand for more. This wasn't gentle. It wasn't love. It was a storm, a desperate clawing for release, from a pressure that had been building for months, in courtrooms and boardrooms, and in the chilling quiet of my own home. His name, a curse on my lips during the day, became a muffled prayer against his shoulder in the dark. A low groan escaped him, a sound of pure, selfish pleasure that vibrated through my own body, and I arched against him, my nails digging into the hard muscle of his back as the feeling crested. It was a wave of fire, a shuddering release that felt less like pleasure and more like a shattering, a brief, blinding oblivion from who I was and what I had just done. He rolls off me, and in the space he leaves, reality, cold and sharp, floods back in. He is just a silhouette against the city lights now, his chest rising and falling. He is not my husband, he is my enemy. My name is Alara, and the man whose sweat is still cooling on my skin is Julian Thorne, the lead counsel for the corporate giant that is methodically, brilliantly, trying to gut my company and destroy everything I have ever worked for. For 8 hours a day, we are adversaries, armed with legal precedents and sharp-tongued objections. We fight over clauses and depositions, each trying to land a killing blow. But for a few stolen hours a month, we become this. Two bodies tangled in expensive sheets, seeking a different kind of victory, a different kind of ruin. My husband, David, thinks I'm in the city for late-night strategy sessions. And in a way, I am. I am strategizing my own self-destruction. Our marriage had become a beautiful, empty house, full of polite silences, and the ghost of a warmth we'd long since lost. The loneliness was an ache, a physical void. And into that void, Julian walked, not with comfort, but with a fire that matched my own despair. This is the story of how I crossed the line, not once, but over and over again. How I learned the intoxicating taste of contempt and found a terrifying home in the arms of the one man I should have hated most. It didn't begin in a bedroom. It began in a place of defeat, on a Tuesday in October when the sky over New York had been weeping a cold, miserable rain since dawn. We had been in depositions for 9 straight hours, and Julian had systematically, and with the surgical precision of a master torturer, dismantled my key witness. He had twisted his words, used his own pride against him, and left him looking like a fool. By extension, he had made me look like a fool. I felt hollowed out, the loss echoing in the pit of my stomach. I told my driver to drop me a few blocks from my apartment, lying that I needed the air, but the truth was I couldn't bear the thought of walking into the silent, pristine space I shared with David. I couldn't face his well-meaning but ultimately useless question. How was your day? How could I explain a day like that? How could I explain the feeling of being intellectually filleted by a man I was supposed to despise? Instead, I found myself pushing open the heavy oak door of a place called the Scribe's Rest, a small, dark bar tucked away on a side street, the kind of place that smelled of old leather, spilled whiskey, and secrets. It was mostly empty, a sanctuary from the storm. I slid into a booth in the farthest, darkest corner and ordered a bourbon, neat. I just wanted to feel the burn in my throat, to let the noise in my head subside. I stared into the amber liquid, replaying every mistake, every missed objection, every moment Julian's cool gray eyes had met mine across the table, a flicker of triumphant cruelty in them. I hated him. I truly, deeply hated the professional part of him, the part that was currently trying to ruin my life. I took a long sip, the fire of the bourbon a welcome distraction. I was on my second sip when the bell above the door chimed softly, and a gust of damp, cold air swept through the bar. And then I saw him, Julian Thorne. His trench coat was dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked, for the first time since I'd met him, not like a predator, but like a man who had also been dragged through hell, His shoulders were slumped with fatigue. He ran a hand through his wet hair, pushing it back, and for a fleeting, insane moment, my mind didn't register enemy. It registered exhausted. He scanned the room, and his eyes, those weapons-grade eyes, landed on me. I saw a flicker of surprise, the same jolt I felt myself. My entire body tensed, my hand tightened around my glass. This was a breach of protocol, an unwritten rule. We did not exist in the same social spaces. We were combatants, and this was neutral ground we were now violating. I expected him to turn, to walk out, to grant us both the professional distance we required. He didn't. He hesitated for only a second, then walked directly toward my booth. My heart began a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a kind of high alert, a terrifying curiosity. What was he doing? He stopped at my table, his shadow falling over me. He wasn't smiling, not the sharp, predatory smile he used in court. His expression was unreadable. "Ilara," he said, his voice lower than I was used to, softer without the acoustics of a boardroom to sharpen its edges. It was the first time he'd used my first name without a miss in front of it. "Julian," I replied, my own voice tight. "Fancy seeing you here." "I could say the same," he said, gesturing vaguely to the room. "My usual spot is being renovated." This was the next closest place to drown my sorrows. The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. Or celebrate a victory, depending on your perspective. The jab was gentle, but it was still a jab. "I'm sure you have much to celebrate," I said, the ice in my tone unmistakable. He held my gaze for a moment, and then he did something that completely disarmed me. He sighed. It was a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from his bones. "It was a brutal day," he said, and the admission hung in the air between us. For everyone. He looked at the empty seat opposite me. "May I?" Every instinct screamed no. This was dangerous. This was wrong. But I was so tired of fighting and so profoundly lonely in that moment that the word that came out of my mouth was a quiet, "Fine." He slid into the booth, placing his briefcase on the seat beside him. He smelled of rain and expensive cologne. Up close, without a conference table between us, I could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He ordered a scotch from the passing waitress, and for a few moments, we sat in a silence that was thick with everything unsaid. "He was a good witness," Julian said finally, swirling the ice in his new drink. "Your man, the engineer, he was solid, honest." "You made him sound like a liar and an idiot," I countered, the bitterness creeping back in. "That's my job," he said simply, without apology, but also without pride. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and his gaze was different. It wasn't adversarial. It was analytical, but in a personal way. "You prepped him well. Your line of questioning about the patent timeline was brilliant. It almost worked." The compliment, coming from him, was so unexpected it felt like a physical shock. I didn't know how to respond. "Almost isn't good enough in our line of work," I mumbled, staring back down at my glass. "No," he agreed softly. "It never is." He took a drink of his scotch. "Does it ever let up for you?" The pressure. The question was so direct, so personal, it caught me completely off guard. I looked up, and he was watching me with an intensity that had nothing to do with the lawsuit. He was seeing me, Ilara, the woman drowning under the weight of it all. I thought of David, who saw my stress as an inconvenience, an interruption to our placid domestic life. He never asked what it felt like. He only asked when it would be over. I found myself giving an honest answer for the first time in months. "No," I whispered, "it doesn't." A shared understanding passed between us. A silent acknowledgement of the life we both led. The long hours, the immense stakes, the isolation. We talked for nearly an hour. We never mentioned the specifics of the case again. Instead, we talked about the law school professors we'd both hated, about the first case we'd ever lost, about the ridiculous demands of our senior partners. He told a dryly funny story about a billionaire client who insisted on having his dog present during all negotiations. I found myself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty in my throat. As I laughed, he watched me, and a small, true smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing the ruthless lawyer and revealing someone else entirely. In that moment, I wasn't looking at my nemesis. I was looking at a man who understood a part of my life that my own husband couldn't begin to comprehend. I noticed the small details, the way his dark hair fell over his brow when he leaned forward, the deep timbre of his voice when it wasn't being weaponized. The intelligence in his eyes, which I had always interpreted as cunning, now seemed like something deeper, more complex. A dangerous warmth began to spread through my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the bourbon. It was the terrifying warmth of connection. When he looked at his watch, I felt a strange pang of disappointment. "I should go," he said. "Early start tomorrow." He signaled for the check, and before I could protest, he'd placed a bill on the table that covered both our drinks. "My pleasure," he said, cutting off my objection. He stood up, shrugging on his still damp coat. "See you in the trenches, Alara," he said, that small, wry smile returning for a brief moment. And then he was gone, the bell on the door chiming his exit, leaving me alone in the booth. I sat there for a long time, the imprint of his presence still hanging in the air. The rain was still beating against the windows. Nothing had happened. We had a drink, we talked. It was a professional courtesy, a moment of ceasefire. That's what I told myself. But I knew it was a lie. Something had shifted. A line had been blurred. In the cold, sterile war of our professional lives, Julian Thorne had lit a small, dangerous spark. And I knew, with a certainty, that both thrilled and horrified me, that I wanted to get closer to the flame. That night in the bar cracked something open. In the days that followed, the courtroom, once a straightforward battlefield, became a theater of unspoken things. The air between us was different, charged with the memory of that shared hour. When our eyes met across the long, polished table, it was no longer just the clash of adversaries. There was a flicker of something else now, a silent acknowledgement of the man behind the lawyer, the woman behind the defendant. It was a dangerous secret, a shared glance that held more intimacy than any conversation I'd had with my husband in months. I found myself watching for it, for those fleeting moments of connection. The slight, almost imperceptible nod he'd give me after I made a sharp point, a sign of respect only I would recognize. Or the way I'd noticed the faint shadow of exhaustion under his eyes, a detail I was now privy to. We were weaving a secret narrative, a story told in glances and silences, right under the noses of our colleagues and the presiding judge. The hatred I had nurtured for him didn't vanish, but it became complicated, layered with a strange and unwelcome empathy. The real breach, the one that sealed my fate, happened a week later. It was nearly 11 at night, and I was alone in my office, surrounded by towers of legal documents that all seemed to blur into one meaningless wall of text. My eyes burned with fatigue. David had called an hour earlier, his voice distant, telling me not to wait up, that he was at a dinner with clients. The words were familiar, the excuse routine. The loneliness of my life felt particularly acute that night. My phone, sitting silent on the desk, was a stark reminder of how few people I had to talk to about anything that truly mattered. Then, an email notification lit up the screen. The sender, Julian Thorne. My heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. The subject line was innocuous. Sterling deposition, Exhibit 4B. My mind raced. Was it a trick? A late-night legal maneuver? I opened it with a sense of dread. The body of the email was professional, a concise query about a minor point in a document we had argued over that afternoon. It was a question that could have waited until morning. But then, after his formal digital signature, there was a postscript. Just one line. P.S. I hope you're not trying to survive on bourbon alone tonight. I stared at the words. My breath caught in my throat. It was a direct reference to our conversation, a secret key slipped under the door of our professional correspondence. It was personal. It was deliberate. I quickly glanced around my empty office, as if someone could see the words on my screen, see the slow smile spreading across my face. It felt illicit and thrilling. A simple line of text had reached across the city and touched me, a small spark in the vast, lonely darkness of my office. I typed and deleted a dozen responses, before settling on something I hoped was casual. Don't worry, Thorn. I graduated to coffee. Some of us have to work for a living. I hit send, my pulse thrumming. His reply came back in less than a minute. Touché. The view from my office is just as uninspiring. Burning the midnight oil is less glamorous than they make it seem. And just like that, the floodgates opened. Our communication shifted from formal emails to the more fluid, instantaneous world of text messages. At first, we maintained the pretense of work. Did you see Miller's face when you cited the Harrison case? He texted one afternoon. I thought he was going to swallow his own gavel. I texted back, a secret smile on my face as I sat opposite my own legal team, who were oblivious. We were building a private world, one text at a time. The messages became our secret shorthand. Long day? Was his way of asking. Are you okay? My reply, the usual, meant, I'm exhausted and I wish I was talking to you instead. I became addicted to the vibration of my phone in my pocket, the little ping that signaled a message from him. I would angle my screen away from David in the evenings, my heart hammering with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. These brief, stolen exchanges were becoming the brightest points in my day. They were harmless, I told myself. Just words on a screen. A way to blow off steam with the only person on earth who truly understood the pressure cooker I was in. About a week into our secret correspondence, the inevitable escalation happened. It was after midnight. I was in bed, pretending to read, while David slept beside me, his breathing deep and even. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Julian. Too complicated to type. Can you talk? I looked at David's sleeping form, the chasm between us feeling wider than ever. My hands were trembling as I typed back a simple, yes. I slipped out of bed, creeping out of the room like a thief. I went into my study and closed the door, my heart pounding so hard, I was sure David would hear it. I pressed the call button. He picked up on the first ring. Alara? His voice. It was the first time I'd heard it so directly, so intimately, without the background noise of the world. It was a low, quiet sound in my ear, a deep rumble that felt like a physical presence. Hi, I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry to call so late, he began, the pretense of politeness still there. It's about the motion to compel. He started talking about some legal point, some strategy, but I barely heard the words. I was mesmerized by the sound. The courtroom cadence was gone. This was his late-night voice, laced with fatigue, and something else, something softer. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cool leather of my chair. I could picture him so clearly, sitting in his own dark study across town, a glass of scotch in his hand, his tie loosened. I imagined the broad slope of his shoulders under his crisp shirt, a detail I had only glimpsed in court, but that my mind now colored in with vivid detail. This, I realized with a jolt, was more dangerous than any flirtation. This was an invasion of the imagination. Alara, are you there? His voice cut through my reverie. Sorry, I said quickly. Yes, the motion. You were saying, forget the motion, he said, his tone shifting. That was just an excuse. I wanted to hear your voice. The admission was so blunt, so honest, it left me breathless. How are you holding up? He asked, and the question was so full of genuine concern that it cracked my carefully constructed defenses. I found myself telling him the truth. I told him about the fear, the gnawing anxiety that kept me awake at night. I told him about the crushing responsibility, the feeling of 200 employees' livelihoods resting on my shoulders. I talked, and he just listened. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened, interjecting with a quiet, I know, or, that sounds impossibly hard. And then he began to talk. He spoke of the suffocating legacy of his family's law firm, the pressure to be Julian Thorne, the brilliant shark, every single day. He confessed a weariness that went beyond the job, a dissatisfaction with the perfect, sterile life he had built with his perfect society wife. We were no longer Alara and Julian, the adversaries. We were just two people, whispering our deepest anxieties into the darkness, connected by a thin, invisible wire. I was giving him the parts of me I kept hidden from everyone, especially my husband. The vulnerability, the fear, the doubt, and he was doing the same. It was an affair of the mind, a seduction of the soul, and it felt more profound, more real than the polite, passionless marriage I was living in. When we finally hung up an hour later, the silence in my house was deafening. I stood in my study for a long time, looking out at the sleeping city. I hadn't touched him. We hadn't even been in the same room, but I knew, with the kind of certainty that sinks into your bones, that I had just been profoundly unfaithful, and I knew I would do it again tomorrow. The phone calls became our lifeline, a secret world built of whispers in the dark. But a world made of words is a fragile thing. It cannot hold back the tide of what is real, of what the body wants. The inevitable happened in Chicago. We were both required to attend a national litigation conference, a 3-day affair held in a vast, soulless hotel that felt like a space station marooned in the heart of the city. For 2 days, we played our parts perfectly. We moved in different circles, attending different seminars. If we passed in the sprawling, carpeted hallways, we would exchange a brief professional nod, our eyes holding for a fraction of a second too long. That shared glance was a jolt of electricity, a reminder of the secret humming just beneath the surface of our public lives. Being in the same physical space, breathing the same recycled air, but being unable to talk, to touch, was a unique form of torture. It made our secret connection feel more potent, more real. The distance made the pull stronger. On the final night, after the closing dinner, I couldn't face the thought of my silent hotel room. I escaped to the hotel's bar, a cavernous space called the Meridian, designed with dark wood and low lighting to give the illusion of intimacy. It was crowded with lawyers, their laughter and chatter a dull roar. I found a small table in a corner, hoping to disappear. I ordered a glass of wine, telling myself I just needed an hour to decompress before facing the next day's flight back to my real life, back to the battle, back to the quiet emptiness of my marriage. I was halfway through my glass when I felt a presence. I didn't even need to look up. I could feel his energy, a shift in the atmosphere. I slowly raised my eyes, and there he was, standing near the entrance, scanning the room. His gaze met mine, and there was no surprise in his eyes, only a kind of weary resignation. This was not a coincidence. It was an appointment we had both wordlessly made. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease and stopped at my table. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. His voice, the same low timbre from our phone calls, but hearing it here, in person, sent a shiver down my spine. "It is now," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He sat down, and the noisy bar seemed to fade into the background. Suddenly, it was just the two of us, enclosed in a bubble of palpable tension. The easy intimacy of our late-night calls evaporated, replaced by a charged, almost awkward silence. Being this close, I could see the flecks of silver in his dark hair at his temples, the faint scar that cut through one of his eyebrows. Real details. Dangerous details. "I hate these things," he said, breaking the silence. "Forced enthusiasm and bad food. And an open bar to make it all bearable," I added, gesturing with my glass. He smiled, that slow, wry smile that did unsettling things to my insides. He ordered a scotch, and we fell into a conversation that skirted the edges of everything important. We didn't talk about the case. We didn't talk about our spouses, not directly, but their ghosts were there, sitting with us at the table. We talked about cities we wanted to travel to, books we had read, the shared feeling of being trapped on a hamster wheel of ambition. With every word, the bubble around us grew smaller, tighter. I was acutely aware of his knee, just inches from mine under the small table. I watched the way his long fingers curled around his glass of scotch. He watched my mouth as I spoke. The air was thick with things we weren't saying, with the memory of whispered confessions and the raw, physical awareness of our proximity. When he finished his drink, he looked at his watch. "It's getting late," he said, though his eyes told me he didn't want to leave. "Yes," I agreed, my own voice a little breathless. "I should go." "I'll walk you to the elevators," he offered. A statement, not a question. He stood and waited for me, a simple act of courtesy that felt monumental. The walk through the lobby was the longest of my life. The air crackled between us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body as his arm brushed against mine. We were surrounded by people, but I had never felt so completely alone with someone. We stopped in a small, shadowed alcove by the elevator bank, away from the main flow of traffic. The silence was deafening. I fumbled in my purse for my room key, a prop to busy my hands. "Alara," he said. Just my name. But the way he said it, with that soft, late-night intimacy, was my undoing. I looked up at him. The hunger in his eyes was unmistakable, a mirror of the ache I felt in my own chest. He took a small step forward, closing the last bit of distance between us. The world narrowed to the space of a single breath, and then he leaned down and kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was months of forbidden phone calls, of secret glances, of pent-up longing and frustration crashing together in one desperate, explosive moment. His lips were firm and soft at once, tasting of scotch and want. A sound, half gasp, half moan, escaped my throat as his arms snaked around my waist, pulling me hard against him. My hands, of their own accord, came up to fist in the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, holding on as if I were drowning. This was not the calculated, controlled Julian of the courtroom. This was someone else, someone raw and unguarded. He deepened the kiss, his tongue tracing my lips before seeking entrance, and I gave it freely. The clean, sharp scent of his cologne filled my senses. The rough rasp of his evening stubble was an electrifying friction against my skin. His other hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, tilting my head to give him better access. I felt small and consumed, my body melting into his. There was no thought, no guilt, no David, no lawsuit. There was only this. The overwhelming, all-consuming sensation of his mouth on mine, his body pressed against me, the frantic beating of my own heart echoing the rhythm of his. A low groan rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated need that sent a shockwave of heat straight to my core. As quickly as it began, it was over. He broke the kiss, pulling back just enough to look at me. We were both breathing heavily, our chests rising and falling in unison. His eyes were dark, dilated with a mixture of raw desire and stark shock. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before, and as if he had just found something he had been searching for his entire life. The distant ding of an arriving elevator broke the spell. The sounds of the lobby rushed back in. He released me, taking a half step back. The space between us now felt like a canyon, cold and empty. He didn't say a word. He just held my gaze for one more, long, agonizing moment, his expression a storm of conflict. Then, he turned without a word and walked toward the waiting elevator, his back ramrod straight. The doors slid shut, and he was gone. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my fingers pressed to my tingling lips. My entire body was humming, alive with a feeling I had forgotten existed. The line had been crossed. The emotional affair had bled into the physical world, staining it permanently. There was no going back. I was no longer just thinking about betraying my husband. I had done it. The kiss in Chicago left a brand on me. For a week, we returned to our separate lives in New York, but everything was different. The city felt smaller, the air between us charged with a static electricity that hummed through our texts and emails. The unspoken question lingered. What now? We were like two people standing on opposite sides of a chasm we had just created, the single, fragile memory of that kiss stretching between us. I was tormented by it, replaying it in my mind until my lips tingled. The taste of him, the feel of his hands, the sheer, shocking force of it. I knew we were standing on a precipice, and I was terrified of the fall. But a part of me, a dark and hungry part, wanted to jump. Julian made the decision for me. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was in a taxi, stuck in traffic, the city's symphony of angry horns, a perfect match for the chaos in my head. My phone buzzed. A text from him. No greeting, no pretense, just 5 words that made my world tilt. I need to see you. A second message followed immediately. Hotel Elysian, room 1208. 8 p.m. I stared at the screen, the taxi's meter ticking up unnoticed. This was it. This was the choice. This was no longer a spontaneous, whiskey-fueled mistake in a faraway city. This was a deliberate, calculated assignation, an act of premeditated betrayal. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to write back. No, to block his number, to end this madness before it truly began. I thought of David. I thought of my wedding vows, a memory now hazy and distant. But then, I thought of Julian's eyes in that hotel lobby, the desperate hunger in his kiss, the sound of his voice whispering my secrets back to me in the dark. I thought of the profound, aching loneliness that awaited me at home. My fingers moved before my brain could stop them, typing a single letter in reply. K. The hours leading up to 8 o'clock were a blur of nervous energy. I went home, showered, and stood before my closet in a trance. My choice of what to wear was a confession in itself. I chose a simple, elegant black dress, but underneath, I wore my most expensive, most forbidden lingerie. A set of black lace, delicate and sheer, something David hadn't seen in years. It was a silent admission of my intent. I was arming myself for a sin. Lying to David was pathetically easy. A last-minute dinner with an out-of-town client. He barely looked up from his iPad. The casualness of my lie and the ease of his acceptance felt like a small, sharp stone in my shoe. The Hotel Elysian was on the Upper East Side, a bastion of quiet, old-money luxury. It was the perfect place to hide a dirty secret. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked through the opulent lobby, feeling like an imposter. I bypassed the front desk and went straight to the elevators, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. The ride up to the 12th floor was agonizingly slow. Walking down the silent, carpeted hallway, the only sound was the frantic pulse in my ears. I stopped before room 1208. For a final, terrifying moment, I considered turning back. But I knew I wouldn't. I was a moth drawn to a flame, and I had to see if I would burn. I raised a trembling hand and knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately. Julian stood there. He wasn't smiling. His face was tense, his eyes dark and intense. He wore a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and dark trousers. He looked like the man from my late-night imaginings. Without a word, he stepped back, and I walked into the room. The door clicked shut behind me, a sound of finality, sealing us off from the world. The room was beautiful, all muted tones and soft lighting, but I barely saw it. I only saw him. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other, the air thick with everything that had led us to this point. He moved first. He reached out, not to kiss me, but to gently take my coat from my shoulders. His fingers brushed my arm, and the touch was electric. He laid it carefully on a chair and then turned back to me. His eyes roamed over my black dress, and I knew he could see the frantic pulse beating at the base of my throat. He slowly reached for the zipper at the back of my dress. As he pulled it down, the soft rasping sound was impossibly loud in the silent room. The dress pooled at my feet, leaving me standing before him in nothing but the lace and my own trembling anticipation. His breath hitched. "God, you're beautiful," he whispered, the words a raw, ragged sound. Seeing the undisguised hunger in his eyes gave me a surge of courage. I stepped forward and began to unbutton his shirt, my fingers clumsy at first, then more confident. I pushed the fabric aside, my palms flattening against the hard warmth of his chest. I felt the thundering of his heart beneath my hands. This was real. This was happening. Soon, all our clothes were in a heap on the floor, and we stood before each other, completely bare. I took in the sight of him, the man I had fought in courtrooms and whispered to on the phone. His body was lean and powerful, the body of a man who carried his stress in the tense lines of his shoulders and back. He looked at me with an intensity that was almost frightening, his gaze sweeping over my breasts, my stomach, the dark curls between my legs. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was one of awe and of a deep, desperate need. He led me to the bed. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a raw, primal urgency. His mouth found mine again, and this time the kiss was deeper, slower, a promise of what was to come. His hands began to explore my body, not with haste, but with a reverent curiosity, as if he were trying to memorize every curve, every hollow. His lips left my mouth and trailed down my neck, across my collarbone, finding the swell of my breast. When his mouth closed over my nipple through the thin lace, a sharp cry escaped my lips. He undid the clasp of my bra and tossed it aside, his gaze fixed on my full, naked breasts. "Perfect," he breathed, before taking me into his mouth again, his tongue and teeth creating a pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. My hands were in his hair, my back arching off the bed. He moved lower, his mouth and hands a torment of pleasure, exploring every inch of me until I was writhing, my mind dissolving into pure sensation. When his tongue finally found the slick, throbbing heat between my legs, I gasped his name. He brought me to a shattering climax with just his mouth, and as the waves of pleasure subsided, he moved up my body, his own need now a palpable force. He positioned himself between my legs. I looked into his eyes, and what I saw there was my own undoing, a man as lost and as hungry as I was. "Alara," he groaned, as if the name itself was a prayer, and then he pushed into me. The feeling of him filling me was overwhelming. It was a perfect fit. All the tension, all the longing, all the months of forbidden thoughts and whispered words culminated in this single, searing act. We began to move together, a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was not the gentle, almost perfunctory act my lovemaking with David had become. This was a battle. It was a storm. It was two people trying to lose themselves inside each other. The sounds that filled the room were raw and unrestrained. The slap of our skin, our ragged, gasping breaths, my muffled moans against the pillow, his low, guttural groans of pleasure. My legs wrapped around his waist, pulling him deeper, wanting more. I met every one of his powerful thrusts with an equal urgency, my body alive and on fire. The pleasure was so intense, so all-consuming, that it erased everything else. There was no room for guilt, no room for thought, only this blinding, physical reality. He drove into me, faster and harder, and I felt the familiar, exquisite tightening deep inside me. He felt it too. He cried out my name, his body going rigid, and as his release flooded me, it triggered my own, a second, violent climax that left me utterly, completely undone. We collapsed together, tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, our hearts pounding in unison. And in the silence that followed, as the storm subsided, the first cold drops of guilt began to fall. I had done it, and I knew my life would never, ever be the same. That first night was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the lighting of a fuse that would snake through the foundations of my life, silent and invisible, waiting for the inevitable detonation. One night of frantic, desperate passion bled into another, and then another. It never started with a grand plan to have an affair. It started with a text from Julian a few days later. "I can't stop thinking about you." And my reply, equally honest and damning, "Me neither." The decision to meet again wasn't a decision at all. It was a surrender to a gravitational pull that was now simply too strong to fight. We fell into a rhythm, a series of secret rituals that became the architecture of our hidden world. The first rule was silence. We never spoke of it on our regular phones. Julian, ever the strategist, set us up with a secure messaging app, the kind that encrypts everything and allows messages to self-destruct. Our communication became a string of cryptic, coded phrases. "Do you have time to review the quarterly projections?" was his way of asking if I was free. "The data looks promising," was my way of saying yes. We became spies in our own lives, masters of deception. I learned to partition my mind, to build a wall between the woman who sat across from her husband at dinner, discussing banalities, and the woman who felt a jolt of pure, illicit thrill when her secret phone buzzed with a new message. Our sanctuary was always the same, the anonymous luxury of a hotel room. We never went to the same one twice in a row. The Westin on a Tuesday, the Four Seasons on a Friday. Julian always paid in cash, a ghost in the system. These rooms, with their identical, impersonal decor, became the only place on earth we could be real. The moment the door clicked shut, the weight of our lives fell away. He was no longer Julian Thorne, the fearsome litigator, and I was no longer Alara, the embattled CEO, the distant wife. We shed those skins with our clothes. Inside those four walls, we were just a man and a woman, bound by a dangerous, insatiable need for each other. The desperate, almost violent energy of that first night began to evolve. As we grew more comfortable, more confident in our secret world, our lovemaking transformed. It was still intense, still passionate, but now it was layered with a new, exploratory freedom. We had the luxury of time, stolen hours where we could learn the geography of each other's bodies, the language of each other's pleasure. There were afternoons of slow, languid lovemaking, where the sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, painting stripes across our naked bodies. He would kiss me for what felt like hours, his touch gentle, worshipful, as if he were trying to heal the parts of me that were broken. He would trace the faint stretch marks on my hips with his fingertips and call them beautiful, and I would believe him. And then there were the nights of pure, unrestrained lust. Nights where he would take me the moment I walked through the door, pushing me up against the cool wall, his mouth devouring mine as he hiked up my dress. He learned that I loved the feeling of his control, the raw possession in his touch. He would take me from behind, his hands tangled in my hair, his body a relentless, driving force. He would whisper filthy, beautiful things in my ear, things that a man like Julian Thorne would never say, and a woman like Alara Vance would never hear. And I would cry out, my voice unrestrained, my pleasure so sharp and overwhelming it felt like a kind of glorious death. The sounds of our passion became our secret symphony, the wet, slick sound of our bodies moving together, his ragged breathing, my shameless, open-mouthed moans of ecstasy. We explored every inch of the physical landscape between us. I learned the exquisite pleasure of pleasing him, of taking him in my mouth and feeling the tremor run through his body as I brought him to the edge. There was a unique power in it, a feeling of control that I lacked in every other area of my life, and he, in turn, worshipped my body with his mouth. He was a patient, skillful lover, delighting in my pleasure. He would spend an eternity bringing me to the brink, his tongue a torment of delight, until I was begging him, pleading for release. He taught me that my body was an instrument capable of a pleasure so profound, I had never imagined it was possible. Our sexual vocabulary expanded. We made love in the shower, the hot water sluicing over our bodies, my back pressed against the cold marble, his hands gripping my hips. We did it on the plush carpets, on the desk, with the city lights as our backdrop. When I was on top of him, straddling his hips, I felt a soaring sense of power, looking down into his eyes, seeing the raw need for me etched on his face as I controlled the rhythm, the pace, the depth. I was his, and in that moment he was utterly, completely mine. But it was more than just the sex. I became addicted to the ritual itself. The thrill began with the ping of the secret phone. It built with the nervous, heart-pounding taxi ride across town. It crested in that moment when the hotel room door opened, and I saw him, and the rest of the world ceased to exist. The sex was the explosive culmination, but the addiction was to the entire experience, the escape, the danger, the intoxicating feeling of being the sole focus of someone's intense, undivided attention. In those stolen hours, I felt more vibrant, more intelligent, more beautiful, more alive than I did in the entire rest of my week. The come-down, however, was always brutal. I would slip out of the hotel bed before dawn while he was still sleeping. I would shower away the scent of him, a futile act, because it felt like it had seeped into my pores, branded my skin. I would dress in the silence, watching his sleeping form, a man who was both my salvation and my ruin. And then I would step out of the hotel into the cool gray morning, the city just beginning to stir. I would get in a cab, my body humming with the aftershocks of pleasure, my mind already replaying every touch. But as the taxi pulled away, the intoxicating high would begin to fade, replaced by the cold, creeping dread of reality. The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy weight in my chest. I was living a lie, a spectacular, thrilling, and utterly corrosive lie. And as I watched the city wake up, I knew that the fire that made me feel so alive was also burning my entire world to the ground. Our affair settled into a strange and intoxicating domesticity. The hotel rooms, once symbols of transgression, began to feel like home, the only true home I had. In these anonymous spaces, my obsession with Julian deepened, moving beyond the thrill of the act itself and into a microscopic fascination with the man, with the physical reality of him. My mind became a secret catalog of his details, a library of sensations that I would revisit in the lonely, quiet hours of my real life. It was an intoxication of the skin, a fixation so profound it rewrote my understanding of desire. I learned the landscape of his body like a blind woman learning a new language. I became obsessed with his hands. In court, they were weapons gesturing with sharp, dismissive precision, holding a pen like a scalpel, but in our room, they were instruments of exquisite pleasure. I would trace the blue veins that ran down his forearms, a roadmap of the strength he used to pull me closer. I loved the contrast of his calloused fingertips, a surprise on a man so polished, against the softness of my inner thigh. His hands knew me. They knew the exact pressure to apply to the small of my back to make me arch against him, the precise way to cut my jaw when he was about to kiss me senseless. I memorized the architecture of his back, the tense, powerful muscles across his shoulders that held the weight of his world. I would spend hours just touching him, my fingers kneading the knots of stress, feeling them slowly release under my touch. There was a particular hollow at the base of his spine, just above the waistband of his trousers. That became my favorite place to rest my thumb. It felt like an anchor point, the center of his gravity. It was a part of him no one else saw, a detail I hoarded like a secret treasure. And his scent. It was the most addictive thing of all. It was a complex mixture of his expensive, clean-smelling soap, the faint, pleasant aroma of the starch in his shirts, and underlying it all, his own unique, masculine scent, a warm and musky smell that was amplified when our bodies were hot and slick with sweat. After our meetings, it would cling to my hair, to the fabric of my clothes. I would be in a board meeting the next day and catch a faint whiff of him on my own skin, and my heart would give a guilty lurch. It was a constant, damning, and utterly thrilling reminder of where I had been. But just as I was learning him, I was also being learned. I started to see my own body, not through my own critical eyes, but through the undisguised hunger in his. He found beauty in places I had only ever seen flaws. I had always been self-conscious of my hips, the womanly curve of my buttocks that I felt was too generous. But Julian worshipped them. He would grip my hips firmly when he took me from behind, his hands molding to my curves as if they were made for him. This, he would groan into my ear, his voice thick with lust. This is what a woman should feel like. His desire didn't make me feel objectified. It made me feel powerful, celebrated for my femininity in a way I hadn't felt in a decade. The most profound discovery was the way he treated my imperfections. I have fine, silvery lines on my stomach, faint stretch marks from a pregnancy I'd lost years ago, a private grief I had buried deep. I had always seen them as a sad reminder of failure. One evening, as we were lying tangled in the sheets after a particularly tender session, he began to trace them with his finger, his touch feather-light. I flinched, instinctively wanting to cover myself. "Don't," he whispered. He leaned down and kissed them, one by one. "This is the map of your life, Alara," he said, his voice soft and serious. "This is where you've been. It's beautiful." In that moment, with his lips on the part of my body I was most ashamed of, he offered me a kind of acceptance, a healing, that felt more intimate than any sexual act. He wasn't just fucking my body, he was seeing my history, and he wasn't turning away. Our lovemaking became our primary language. We could communicate more in a single, silent hour than I could with David in a month of conversation. A rough, frantic session was our way of burning off the shared frustration of a difficult day in court, a way to reclaim each other from the battle. A slow, languid afternoon of gentle touches and soft kisses was a silent apology after a tense phone call, a reaffirmation of our private truce. We learned to read the subtle cues in each other's bodies. I could feel the day's stress and the tension of his jaw and would know to kiss him slowly, to soothe him before seeking my own pleasure. He could see the exhaustion in the slight slump of my shoulders and would know to simply hold me, to let me feel safe before letting passion take over. This intense physical communion created a dangerous illusion. The lines between lust and love, between the body and the soul, began to blur into oblivion. How could I know the exact sound of his breathing right before he climaxed and not call it love? How could he know the secret places on my skin that made me tremble and not be in love with me? The intoxication of the skin became a stand-in for a connection of the heart. In those hotel rooms, wrapped in his arms, his scent filling my senses, I felt cherished, understood, and desired in the most fundamental way possible. I began to believe that this secret, sordid, and all-consuming affair was the great love story of my life. I would go home and lie in the dark next to my sleeping husband, my body still humming with the memory of Julian's touch. I would lift the collar of my silk pajama top to my nose, trying to find one last, lingering trace of his scent. I would inhale it like a drug, a final hit to get me through the night. The obsession was total. I was no longer a woman having an affair. I was an addict, and the drug was his skin. The intoxicating haze of an affair cannot last forever. Like any potent drug, the highs begin to diminish, and the price you pay for them becomes steeper. The secret rituals that once felt thrilling and subversive started to feel like the frantic, paranoid maintenance of a crime scene. The lies I told David, once delivered with a cool confidence, began to catch in my throat. The constant vigilance was exhausting. Every unexpected phone call, every casual question from my husband about my day, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline and fear through me. The affair, my beautiful, dangerous escape, was beginning to feel like a cage of my own making. The cracks in the facade began to appear, small at first, then spreading like a spiderweb across the fragile surface of my life. The first real tremor, the one that shook me to my core, happened on a Wednesday afternoon. We had stolen 2 hours at a boutique hotel in Soho. It was a flawless afternoon. The sex was slow and deep, a silent conversation between two people who now knew each other's bodies intimately. Afterwards, we lay tangled in the sheets, the city humming below us, feeling for a brief, perfect moment, like a normal couple. But the return to reality is always jarring. We followed our rules meticulously. I left first, giving him a 10-minute buffer. I took the elevator down, smoothed my dress, and composed my face into one of neutral professionalism. I walked through the small, chic lobby, my mind already on a conference call I had in an hour. And then, I saw her. Standing by the concierge desk, talking on her phone, was Claire, Julian's wife. My blood ran cold, the world tilted, the air sucked from my lungs. It was a 1 in 8 million chance, a statistical impossibility that felt like a deliberate act of a cruel god. She was flawless, of course. Tall, blonde, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, the very picture of the high-powered corporate wife I had imagined. She hadn't seen me. I had a split second to react. I ducked my head, turning sharply and walking toward a different exit, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. I pushed through the door and onto the street, gulping in the city air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I hailed the first taxi I saw and collapsed into the back seat, shaking. She hadn't seen me. But what if she had? What if I had been 1 second later? What if Julian had left a minute earlier? The near miss was a brutal reminder of the razor's edge we were walking on. Our secret world wasn't a bubble. It was a flimsy tent, pitched in the middle of a hurricane. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The face of the woman whose life I was helping to dismantle, one sordid hotel room at a time. The guilt became a constant companion, a sour taste in my mouth. A few days later, David and I were at a charity gala. He was in his element, charming and handsome in his tuxedo. He put his arm around my waist, pulling me close to whisper in my ear. "You're the most beautiful woman in the room," he said, his voice warm with genuine pride. A year ago, that comment would have made me smile. That night, it felt like a slap. His touch, once a comfort, now felt like an accusation. His trust in me, his complete lack of suspicion, was the most painful indictment of all. I looked at this good man, my husband, who believed I was a woman worthy of his pride, and I felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled my knees. I had to excuse myself, fleeing to the ladies' room, where I splashed cold water on my face, staring at the stranger in the mirror. Her eyes were haunted. Her smile was a lie. The crack finally splintered wide open during my next encounter with Julian. We were in a familiar room at the Mercer. He must have sensed my distraction, my distance. He tried to bring me back to him, his touch more tender, his kisses deeper. He laid me back on the bed, and we began to make love. He moved above me, his body a familiar, welcome weight. He whispered my name, telling me how much he had missed me. And then it happened. As he moved inside me, in what should have been a moment of ultimate connection, my mind betrayed me. I wasn't in the room anymore. I was back in that hotel lobby, seeing Claire's blonde hair. I was at the gala, feeling the weight of David's trusting hand on my back. Julian's face above me blurred, and for a horrifying second, it morphed into my husband's. The rhythm of their bodies, his and mine, suddenly felt cheap and sordid. The pleasure I should have been feeling curdled into disgust. This wasn't a sacred act in a private sanctuary. This was a tawdry, pathetic betrayal, happening in a generic room that hundreds of other people had used for their own lonely, selfish reasons. Tears began to stream silently from the corners of my eyes. I went limp beneath him, my body unresponsive. Julian stopped moving immediately. "Alara?" he whispered, his voice laced with concern. He pulled back, propping himself up on his elbows to look at me. "What is it? What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, the silent tears turning into quiet, choked sobs. The spell was broken. The beautiful, intoxicating illusion we had built was shattered. He rolled off me, pulling the sheet over my body, and just held me. But his touch was no longer a comfort. It was the touch of my co-conspirator. We weren't lovers escaping the world. We were two guilty people, hiding from the damage we were causing. That night was the beginning of the end of my delusion. The affair, my great escape, had become its own kind of prison. The thrill had been replaced by a gnawing, constant fear. When I went home and looked in the mirror, I finally saw the truth. My face was thinner. My eyes had dark circles beneath them that no amount of concealer could hide. There was a permanent tension in my jaw. I looked like a stranger, a woman haunted by her own choices. I was living two lives, and the strain of holding them apart was causing me to fracture down the middle. The facade wasn't just cracking anymore, it was about to crumble, and I was terrified of who I would be when it all came crashing down. The psychological crack, once formed, is impossible to seal. After that night of tears and broken illusions, our affair took on a new, darker texture. The guilt was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of everything. The sex, while still a physical necessity, was now haunted by what we were, by the damage we were causing. In my weakness, I began to lean on Julian even more, not for the thrill, but for a kind of desperate reassurance. He was the only person who knew the full extent of my fragmentation, and in a twisted way, that made me trust him more. In the quiet aftermath of our lovemaking, I would confess my fears, my deepest anxieties about the lawsuit. It was in one of these moments of raw post-coital vulnerability that I handed him the weapon he would later use to stab me. "I'm going to lose, Julian," I whispered into the darkness of the hotel room, my head resting on his chest, his heartbeat a steady, calming rhythm beneath my ear. "It's not about the evidence anymore. It's about my people. They're at their breaking point." He stroked my hair, murmuring comforting sounds. I continued, the words tumbling out in a torrent of anxiety. "My lead engineer, Mark. He's brilliant, the heart of our entire patent. But his daughter is sick, really sick. He's drowning in medical bills. He's barely sleeping. The stress is eating him alive. Your firm is putting so much pressure on him, and I'm terrified he's going to crack on the stand. If he cracks, we're finished." I confess this not as a CEO discussing a strategic weakness, but as a person confessing her fear of failing someone who depended on her. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated vulnerability. He held me tighter. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice a firm promise in the dark. "I've got you." And like a fool, I believed him. A week later, I was sitting in the cold, sterile conference room where we were deposing Mark. The air was thick with tension. Julian was, as always, brilliant and precise. For the first 2 hours, the questioning was standard, a technical deep dive into the patent schematics. Mark was holding his own, his answers clear and confident, and I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. Then, Julian shifted his approach. The change was subtle, a slight change in his tone, a new intensity in his gaze as he looked at Mark. "Mr. Jennings," Julian began, his voice deceptively soft. "This project has consumed the last 3 years of your life, has it not? Long hours? Late nights?" Mark agreed cautiously. "An immense amount of pressure, I'd imagine," Julian continued, "to get everything right. A single mistake, a single miscalculation in the code could render the entire project worthless." He let that hang in the air. He wasn't just talking about the patent anymore. He was talking about failure. I felt a prickle of unease. My hands, resting on the table, curled into fists. Julian then leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone of mock sympathy. "Tell me, Mr. Jennings, with that kind of professional pressure, how do you manage to stay focused? It must be difficult to give your full attention to such complex work when you're facing significant pressures in your personal life as well." The blood drained from my face. He didn't say the words "sick daughter." He didn't have to. The implication was a surgical strike, aimed directly at the weak spot I had handed him on a silver platter. Mark's composure crumbled. A flicker of panic crossed his face, his confident posture deflating. He began to stammer, his answers becoming confused, defensive. I watched in absolute horror as Julian, the man who had held me and promised to protect me, used my own whispered fears as a tactical blueprint to dismantle my most important witness. He was a shark that had scented blood in the water, and I had been the one to show him where the wound was. The room began to spin. Was this whole thing, every touch, every kiss, every whispered confession, just an elaborate honey trap? The trust I had so foolishly placed in him didn't just crack, it vaporized. I stormed out of the deposition before it was over. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I sent him a single furious text message. The Elysian, 9 p.m. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. That night, the hotel room was not a sanctuary. It was a crucible. I was pacing like a caged animal when he arrived. The moment he closed the door, I flew at him. "You used me," I hissed, my voice trembling with a rage, so pure it felt like acid. "You took what I gave you in confidence, what I gave you in a moment of weakness, and you turned it into a weapon." He had the decency to look conflicted, his face a mask of turmoil. "Alara, it's not that simple. It's my job." "Your job?" I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Is it your job to sleep with opposing counsel to gain an advantage? Is that the kind of lawyer you are, Julian?" The argument escalated, our voices rising from sharp whispers to raw, angry shouts. The space between us crackled with betrayal and fury, and then words failed us. He reached for me, his hands gripping my upper arms, his face inches from mine. "Don't you know this is killing me too?" he said, his voice a raw groan. And then his mouth was on mine. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of violence, of desperation. It was angry and punishing, his teeth grazing my lip, my hands fisted in his shirt, trying to push him away and pull him closer at the same time. This was not seduction. This was war. He pushed me back toward the bed, and we fell onto it, a tangle of limbs in fury. The sex that followed was a brutal, desperate exorcism. It was a way for me to punish him, to use my body to claw back some semblance of control. And it was a way for him to silence my accusations, to try and reestablish the one connection between us that was undeniable, the raw, physical pull. Every thrust was a question. Every moan was an accusation. My nails raked his back, drawing blood, and he seemed to welcome the pain, his own movements becoming harder, faster, more desperate. This wasn't the sound of pleasure. It was the sound of anguish, of two people trying to fuck away a problem that was far too deep to be solved by the friction of skin. My cries were not of ecstasy, but of a heartbreaking mixture of pleasure and pain, my body betraying my mind by responding to the touch of the man I now believed had so callously used me. The climax, when it came, was not a release. It was a violent, shuddering spasm that felt more like a seizure, a complete system overload that left us both broken and gasping in the wreckage. We lay apart, on opposite sides of the bed, the sheets a mess between us. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and the metallic tang of resentment. The physical storm had passed, leaving a dead, empty silence in its wake. My question, the one that truly mattered, still hung in the poisoned air between us. Was any of it real? He turned his head on the pillow and looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. And I knew in that moment that our affair, my beautiful, intoxicating escape, had finally and irrevocably become the very weapon that would destroy me. The storm of our anger and passion receded, leaving behind a dead, suffocating calm. We lay on opposite sides of the bed, the tangled sheets a testament to the battle that had just occurred. The space between us was a chasm, miles of scorched earth. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sweat and the bitter odor of betrayal. The city lights outside the window seemed dimmer, colder. For a long time, the only sound was our breathing, two separate ragged rhythms in the dark. The fury had burned out of me, leaving nothing but a hollow, aching emptiness. I felt old, ancient, worn down to the bone by the sheer weight of my own stupidity. I turned my head on the pillow to look at him. He was staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. The anger was gone. There was no point to it anymore. It was like screaming at the rain. All I wanted now, all I needed before I could even begin to comprehend the totality of my ruin, was the truth. Not the version he thought I wanted to hear, not a justification, just the cold, hard, unvarnished fact of the matter. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet, devoid of all emotion. It was a stranger's voice. "I'm not going to yell anymore. I'm too tired. Just tell me, was any of it real? Or was it all just a means to an end for you?" I paused, gathering the last of my strength. I deserved to know which version of the fool I am. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He closed his eyes, a long, slow shudder, and when he opened them, something in them had broken. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, his back to me. For a long moment, he just sat there, his head in his hands, the picture of defeat. The muscles in his powerful back were coiled tight, with a tension that had nothing to do with the lawsuit. "Yes," he said finally, his voice so low I could barely hear it. "I used it. The information you gave me." He didn't turn to look at me. He couldn't. "When you told me about Mark, about his daughter, the lawyer in my head, the predator, it saw a weakness. It's a reflex, Alara. It's a disgusting, ingrained instinct from 20 years of doing this. To see a vulnerability and to press on it until it breaks. It's who I am. It's what I do." I said nothing. I just listened, the coldness spreading from my chest through my entire body. He took a deep, shuddering breath. But that's not the whole truth. He finally turned and his face was a ruin. The cool, confident mask of Julian Thorne was gone, replaced by the face of a desperate, broken man. "You have to understand my life," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "My marriage. Claire and I. We're a business. A merger of two powerful families. We host the right dinners. We attend the right charities. We maintain the brand. It is a hollow, gilded cage. We live in the same house, but we haven't shared a bedroom in 5 years. There is no warmth, no intimacy, no truth. It is a life of perfect, soul-crushing performance." He looked at me, his eyes begging for me to understand. "My entire life has been about being what people expect me to be. The brilliant son, the ruthless lawyer, the successful husband. The noise of it, the pressure of maintaining that facade, it never stops. I go to sleep with it. I wake up with it. Most days, I don't even know who I am anymore underneath it all." He got up from the bed and began to pace, his nakedness making his confession seem all the more raw, all the more exposed. "And then, I met you. At first, you were just a challenge. The brilliant, fiery CEO on the other side of the table, an adversary to be defeated. And maybe, in the darkest part of my mind, when this thing between us started, Maybe I did see it as a potential advantage. It's ugly, but it's the truth. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes locking with mine. But then something changed. It changed in that bar, when I saw how tired you were. It changed during those late-night phone calls, when I heard the truth in your voice. You weren't a target. You were real. You were smart and funny, and carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. And you were the first real thing I had felt in a decade. He walked back to the bed and knelt on the floor beside me, taking my hand in his. His touch was no longer aggressive, just desperate. Alara, in these rooms, with you, it's the only time the noise stops. It's the only time I'm not performing. When I'm inside you, when you're crying out my name, it's the only time I feel like I actually exist. Not as a lawyer, or a husband, or a thorn, but just as a man. A deeply flawed, selfish man, but a man nonetheless. The tears that had eluded me in my anger now came, silent and hot. So this was it. The naked truth. It was all true. He had used me. He had betrayed my trust in the cruelest way possible, and he had, in his own broken and selfish way, fallen in love with me, or at least with the escape I represented. The two truths weren't contradictory. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. We weren't star-crossed lovers. We were two broken, empty people who had found our own reflection in the other's damage. Our affair wasn't a beautiful, tragic romance. It was a shared symptom of our diseased lives. A frantic, desperate attempt to feel something, anything, in the suffocating emptiness. I looked at him, this man I had hated and desired, and now pitied. I saw the truth of us, laid bare in the wreckage of that hotel room. There was no comfort in it. There was no absolution. There was only a vast, empty sadness that was bigger than the both of us. The anger was gone. The passion was gone. All that was left was the quiet, devastating understanding that we had built our sanctuary on a foundation of lies, and the walls were finally closing in. The truth did not set us free. It shackled us together in a new and more painful way. After his confession, the nature of our meetings changed entirely. The intoxicating, hedonistic energy was gone, replaced by a somber, almost funereal atmosphere. We were no longer passionate lovers stealing time from the world. We were two wounded animals crawling back to a familiar cave to lick our wounds. The sex, when it happened, was a ghost of its former self, a quiet, desperate act of seeking comfort rather than a fiery release of passion. More often than not, we would just lie in the dark, not speaking, the silence thick with our shared, unspoken doom. The affair, which had been my only source of life, was now just another source of profound anxiety. It was a habit we couldn't seem to break, a slow poison we kept sipping, knowing full well it was killing us. The world outside our secret bubble, however, had not been sleeping. The unraveling began not with a grand explosion, but with a quiet, professional threat. It came from Julian's world. He called me on the secure line, his voice tight with a panic I had never heard before. "We have to meet. Now." We met at a sterile business hotel near Grand Central, a place with no memories for us. He was already in the room when I arrived, pacing the floor, his face pale and drawn. He didn't kiss me. He didn't even touch me. He just thrust his phone into my hand. On the screen was a photograph. It was grainy, clearly taken with a long lens camera from across a street. It showed me, bundled in my coat, leaving a small, distinctive hotel in the West Village, the one with the green awning we favored. A timestamp in the corner read 3:15 p.m. He swiped, and another photo appeared, the same hotel entrance. This time, it was him, looking over his shoulder before getting into a taxi. The timestamp read 3:58 p.m. "It's circumstantial," I breathed, my heart a block of ice in my chest. "It doesn't prove anything." "It doesn't have to," he said, his voice ragged. To a man who was looking for a weapon, it's a loaded gun. He took the phone back, his hands shaking slightly. "It's Marcus, a rival at my firm. He's always been jealous of my position on this case. He saw me hesitate during the Mark Jennings deposition. He said it was uncharacteristic. So he hired a private investigator." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The secret was out. It was no longer just a terrifying possibility in my own mind. It was a tangible object, a photograph on a phone, in the hands of our enemy. An enemy who wasn't my husband, but one of his own. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice a hollow whisper. "Everything," Julian said, sinking onto the edge of the pristine, untouched bed. "He wants me to hand over the lead on our case. He wants my accounts, my corner office. He hasn't threatened to expose us to our spouses or the bar association. Not yet. He's smarter than that. He's just using it as internal leverage. For now." And there it was, the end. It hadn't come because of our guilt, or a pang of conscience, or even a lack of desire. It had come in the form of a corporate backstabbing. Our grand tragic passion was being dismantled by petty office politics. The irony was so bitter it tasted like bile. This final meeting was the antithesis of all our others. We sat far apart, fully clothed, on 2 stiff armchairs. The bed between us was a white, empty desert. The lights were on, bright and clinical. It was a business meeting to negotiate the terms of our surrender. Our conversation was quiet, tactical, stripped of all emotion. "We have to delete everything," he said, his voice flat. "The messaging app, the call logs, the phones themselves need to be destroyed. We can never contact each other again, not through any channel. From this moment on, the only time we speak is in a deposition or a courtroom, with a dozen other people present." I nodded, unable to speak. I watched him as he spoke, this brilliant, powerful man, now looking utterly defeated. The weight of the consequences was crashing down on him and on me. He was facing professional blackmail, the potential ruin of the career his entire identity was built upon. I was facing everything else. The loss of my company, the end of my marriage, the public humiliation. Our affair had been a shared escape, but the consequences, I realized, were not going to be shared equally. The sheer, suffocating panic was overwhelming. We had built this intricate, secret world, and now we had to tear it down, brick by brick, before it buried us alive. I took out my secret phone. He took out his. We sat there in sterile silence and began the work of erasing each other, deleting the app, wiping the memory. Every tap of the screen was a small death, the severing of a connection that had been my only lifeline. The entire history of our passion, our confessions, our secret language, vanished into the ether with a few simple clicks. When it was done, an even deeper silence fell over the room. There was nothing left to say. There were no tears, no dramatic final kiss, no promises to remember each other. The risk was too great. The fire was out. All that remained were the cold, gray ashes of fear and regret. He stood up to leave. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the knob. He looked back at me, his eyes full of a sorrow so deep it was bottomless. "Be careful, Alara," he said, his voice barely audible. And then he was gone. I was left alone in the room where we had just performed the autopsy of our affair. I looked around at the impersonal furniture, the pristine bed, the empty glasses. This room, so like the dozens of others where I had felt more alive than anywhere else, now felt like a tomb. The unraveling was not a future event. It was happening now. It was this, the cold, methodical deletion of a life. It was the knowledge that our secret was no longer ours, that it was a weapon in the hands of a hostile party, waiting to be fired. The fuse had been lit, the timer was ticking, and I was walking out of that hotel room and back into a life that was about to be blown to pieces. The end, when it came, was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, quiet unraveling, a series of endings that left me utterly gutted. The lawsuit settled out of court. On paper, we won. They withdrew their primary claim, and my company survived, bruised and bleeding and deeply in debt, but alive. I should have felt relief or triumph. I felt nothing. The victory was hollow, a meaningless postscript to a war that had cost me everything that mattered. I saw Julian one last time during the final proceedings. He looked like a ghost, his face gaunt, his eyes empty. He was flanked by his colleagues, but the ambitious Marcus now stood slightly in front of him, a subtle but clear shift in the firm's power dynamic. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second across the room, and there was no secret acknowledgement, no spark. There was only the shared, silent recognition of our mutual ruin. With the lawsuit over, there were no more excuses for late nights, no more reasons for my distraction. The silence in my house with David became a living entity, a suffocating presence that filled every room. He knew something was fundamentally broken. About a week after the settlement, we were sitting in the living room, the television on, but neither of us watching it. He turned to me, his face etched with a sad, weary confusion. "What happened to us, Alara?" he asked, his voice so gentle it broke my heart. And in the face of his quiet, genuine pain, the lies finally crumbled. The intricate web of deceit I had woven was too exhausting to maintain. I looked at my husband, the man I had promised to honor, and I gave him the only thing I had left to give: the brutal, unvarnished truth. "I had an affair, David," I said, my voice flat, dead. He stared at me, his face uncomprehending. And then I delivered the killing blow. It was with him, Julian Thorne. I saw the exact moment the man I had married died. It wasn't an explosion of anger, it was a quiet implosion. The light in his eyes went out, replaced by a look of such profound shock and disappointment that it will haunt me for the rest of my days. He didn't yell, he didn't throw things. He just nodded, a slow, final acknowledgement of a truth he could not unknow. He stood up, walked upstairs, and began to pack a bag. Our marriage didn't end with a fight. It ended with the soft click of a suitcase latch and the sound of the front door closing quietly behind him, leaving me alone in the wreckage. A year can pass like a lifetime. I sold my majority stake in the company. The fight had gone out of me, and without David, the house was just a collection of empty rooms that echoed with my failures. I moved away from New York, away from the ghosts and the memories. I live in a small coastal town now, a place where the air smells of salt and rain, and no one knows my name. My life is simple. I have a small apartment with a view of the gray, restless ocean. I read books. I take long walks. I am, for all intents and purposes, free. But I've learned that freedom is not the same as peace. Last night, a storm rolled in off the sea. The rain came down in cold, driving sheets, and on impulse, I took refuge in a small, quiet pub on the main street. It was warm inside, smelling of damp wool and old wood. I sat at the bar and ordered a whiskey, and as the bartender poured it, the familiar, peaty aroma of a single malt scotch drifted up to meet me. It was the same brand Julian always drank. And just like that, he was there, a ghost sitting on the stool beside me. I could almost feel the warmth of his hand on my back, hear his low voice in my ear, see the wry, sad smile on his lips. I don't know what happened to him. I never looked him up. I imagine his life went on, tarnished perhaps, but intact. Men like Julian have a way of surviving. But the truth is, I will never know. He exists for me now only as he did in the beginning, as a powerful, intoxicating idea, a memory that ambushes me in quiet moments. I sat there, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, and I asked myself the question for the 1,000th time. What was it? What was that all-consuming force that drove us to burn down our own lives? Was it love? I still don't have the answer. Perhaps it was love, in its most broken, selfish, and destructive form. Or perhaps it was something far simpler. Perhaps we were just two profoundly lonely people, freezing in the dark, who foolishly decided to light a fire to keep warm, forgetting that a fire, once it grows strong enough, consumes everything. It consumes the good, the bad, the truth, the lies. It consumes the house and everyone in it. The fire is out now. All that's left is the lingering scent of smoke and a scar deep in my soul that aches when it rains. I'm a survivor of my own choices, living in the quiet aftermath, and I have learned that some ghosts do not fade with time. You simply learn to live with them.